Hello everybody, this is Jevon Dängeli and welcome to Interviews with Experts. This is the first video recording of this kind in a series that we're creating for the International Association of Coaches, Therapists and Mentors. Today I'm delighted to have an expert on the line with us, and that is Dr. Jessica Bockler, and she'll be speaking to us about creativity and mindfulness pathways to growth. First, a little bit about the delightful person I'll be interviewing today. Dr. Bockler, Jessica, is an applied theatre practitioner and transpersonal psychologist. She specialises in somatic approaches to creative practice, combining expressive dance and arts work with practices enhancing mindfulness and body awareness. She is the director of Creative Alternatives, an arts and mental health service in the northwest of the UK. She is also a founding director of the Alef Trust, which provides online education in the areas of consciousness studies and transpersonal psychology. Jessica, good to have you on the line. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jevon. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
A fascinating subject. I'm very excited to explore a little bit more about creativity and mindfulness with you today. And my first question simply is, what is the relationship between creativity and mindfulness?
It's a fascinating area for me, Jevon, and I've been exploring this for many years now. So as you said in your introduction, I'm an applied arts practitioner with a focus on performing arts theatre predominantly. And I've been working in health contexts for a long time, specifically in the UK, exploring very much under which conditions creative practice might lead to improvements in well-being and health. And so I've had this question that I've pursued for a long time, how a creative approach might aid a recovery process or a personal growth process. And there, looking at this question, I very much believe that the link between creativity and mindfulness is pivotal. So perhaps it's useful to start by looking at some of the research in the area of mindfulness and creativity. So we know to date that mindfulness appears to improve cognitive processes and also personality traits, which are known to correlate with enhanced creative performance. So there's research, for example, that shows that mindfulness can help us to increase our ability to switch perspectives. There's research which shows that mindfulness increases authentic behavior or the fear of being judged. And there's also research which illustrates that mindfulness increases openness to experience. So all of that research really suggests that mindfulness is somehow related to enhancing creativity. And we can make the assumption that this is a sort of uniform relationship. But what's also really interesting is that it's not uniform. It's not that all mindfulness practices are necessarily enhancing creative performance. What more recent research has shown is that there are specific components of mindfulness practice which can foster creativity, and those are specifically open monitoring practices rather than focused attention practices. So open monitoring, that sense of attuning to the present moment here now with a non-judgmental and a self-compassionate attitude, that seems to enable people to pause, to overcome dominant or habitual responses, and that seems to be having a positive effect on creative cognition. So that's one part of the puzzle. Mindfulness can foster creativity in all of us, but that's not all. So it's a longer answer to your question, but it's a complex picture. The opposite. Does creativity necessarily foster mindfulness? I don't think that's the case. So I think there are contexts in which creative practice can foster states of flow. where awareness is heightened in action. And I think that's particularly the case with performing artists, dancers, actors, and musicians who are performing in a live context, in an ensemble often. They're on stage, they're being witnessed by an audience. And those kinds of conditions within those body-based practices, where the body is the instrument very much, that seems to require a very deep paying attention to the unfolding moment. So there's a sort of akinness here to mindfulness. So it's an interesting and dynamic relationship. It's not uniform. There's a lot going on. And you know, you'll want to, I feel like Alice in Wonderland. I feel like I'm going down the tunnel and I'm researching this. I have been for a long time now. And the longer I look, the more nuanced the picture becomes.
Fascinating indeed. I'd be curious to know which, and you have alluded to this already, but I'd like to explore the point a bit more, because there'd be various ways in which people might go about enhancing their creativity.
Yes.
Getting some fresh air, dancing, doing things to invigorate themselves, a certain diet perhaps, maybe even mind-altering substances. What would be distinct in terms of the mindfulness approach, or which mindfulness practice would one employ to cultivate creativity?
So I would, if I can unpack that a little bit, and look at creative practice and the spectrum of creative practice, and then see where I would, you know, look at mindfulness practice and how that relates, and how you can boost your creativity using mindfulness. Let's look at the spectrum of practices in the creative sector, and I would suggest that there are different areas. So we can have creative practice as a hobby, and the aim there might just be about taking a bit of time out, having a bit of, you know, diversion from your daily life. So maybe you don't want to pursue any mindfulness there. There's something of a bit of escapism, and I think that's transportative, a bit like going to the cinema or getting immersed in a really good book. You're in it, you're enjoying it, you're taking time out, and then you're coming back to everyday life, and nothing's really changed. I think that's one area. And I think there is some value in that, because sometimes taking time out is, you know, it's fair enough. We sometimes need downtime, and creative practices can be really good with that. And then another area, as we're mapping this relationship between creativity and mindfulness, another area that I think is really important to consider is the mental health context. So for people who are perhaps mental health practitioners, or social workers or coaches, so if you're working with people who are more vulnerable, then something to consider there is that creative practice can be very evocative. So there's a fascinating body of research that links creative practice to psychopathology, to certain states of overwhelm, psychotic episodes. So if you're working with people who are really very vulnerable, you don't want to plunge them too deeply into a creative process necessarily, specifically working also with body-based practices where you're really immersed, you're really in there. You have to provide a very safe container. How do you ensure that the creative practice doesn't lead to overload? And there, I would then make the link to mindfulness practices, in the sense that the therapist or the coach or the group facilitator needs to enable the client to engage in the creative processes, and needs to be the witness for the unfolding of that process. Within the therapeutic context, I would say that the responsibility for being mindful is very much on part of the therapist. But of course, the therapist, it's a sort of dual relationship, and that the therapist is trying to encourage that within the client also, you know, through various therapeutic techniques, you know, mirroring, being very present with the client as this is unfolding. So creativity and the role of mindfulness in the therapeutic context it's a very dual relationship between the client and the therapist, with the therapist in the lead, providing the container. And then I think there's also another arena, which maybe you and I may be also quite engaged in terms of coaching processes, where individuals pursue a work on themselves, where this is also more in esoteric contexts, where we're working as individuals or in groups, perhaps, utilizing creative practices, where the responsibility is more on the self. There is maybe a guide for a practice, but the guide is encouraging each participant in a group to continuously hold their own process. It's a double-pointed arrow of attention. You're paying attention to yourself and what's unfolding for you, and you're working with what's happening in the group. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but what I wanted to sort of articulate is this sort of spectrum of creative practice, what's out there, and how mindfulness manifests differently in each of those areas. Does that make sense?
It's starting to make sense, and I'm starting to get to grips with just how versatile this practice of mindfulness is. In my own line of work, I've explored mindfulness in terms of dealing with crises. And what you're suggesting here makes me think that mindfulness practices could enhance creativity in crisis management, or dealing with any type of, not particularly any type of pathology, but certainly some types, whereby if one's feeling stuck, rigid, unable to find a solution, then the enhancement of creativity through the vehicle of mindfulness should enable one to find new creative solutions to that very thing in which one was feeling stuck. Would you agree?
Yes, very much so. And sometimes, I'm sorry, actually hearing an echo right now, really unfortunate in terms of this will show up on the video recording.
Yeah, the sound is a little bit strange at the moment. Perhaps we can get away with a bit of poetic license, and since creativity is part of this, let's see if we can continue as we are. And maybe we need to cut out a bit and see if that's possible. We'll be as mindfully creative as we possibly can be.
So hearing myself. Okay. Sometimes I really do think that this dual relationship between creativity and mindfulness is very powerful. The combination of the two. Creative practice on its own can enable people to take time out, to rejuvenate. It might aid socialization in specific contexts if you're entering into a group practice, and thereby it can boost, social skills in individuals, or it can boost self-esteem, create a sense of achievement if you're, part of a group that puts on a show or creates an exhibition, for example, in a local art gallery. But I think add mindfulness into the mix and you're shifting gear. I think it's a very powerful combination, really enabling people to work on themselves. And sometimes that might require the presence of a guide, a therapist, a coach. But ultimately, I think there is something here about that combination in the longer term facilitating a work on oneself, which is tremendously empowering. So that's an area I'm specifically interested in. And I think there are initial hurdles, so when people begin this kind of work, I'm speaking now specifically about a group context. In the group context, I've seen that when I've drawn a mindfulness practice in enhancing a group process, say in a drama group, initially people are a little bit self-aware, they're more self-conscious rather than paying attention to what is happening for them in this very non-judgmental way. Yeah, they're pursuing some kind of self-criticism because they're feeling observed by others whilst moving in the space and doing these practices. So this is mindfulness in action, as it were. I'm applying it using a movement practice. And so initially people are a little bit inhibited. But when that drops away, there's a beautiful shift where you have an ensemble flowing with each other. And people are working on themselves, they're working on their body awareness, they're working on being fully present with each other. And they overcome this sort of tunnel vision, really, of it's just about me and I'm being seen and how am I performing, to I'm in relationship with all these people and something is unfolding between us and we're creating something together. And sometimes it might lead to a public performance. More often than not, I'm immersed in closed group processes which are not seen, not witnessed by public audience, but still this powerful shift from this sort of inhibition initially to this opening of the individual takes place. And I've really seen that specifically when I've combined these movement practices with elements of mindfulness practice. Yeah.
Wonderful. That does make sense to me, as I'm sure it will to many of the viewers, how bringing mindfulness to the creative process sort of removes the obstacles that prevent creative flow and expression in terms of when there is lots of mental dialogue and self-consciousness involved, and that might inhibit the creative flow. How mindfulness can then help to dissolve and loosen these inhibitions and the dialogue, such that one can transcend that and sense something that is more expansive, perhaps, and in so doing, connect with that flow again. This really does make some sense.
Yes, very much so. And I have found just using simple exercises, interweaving it into the creative process is very fruitful. So for example, I might have people working in a group process, they're moving together in the space, they are asked to observe each other's movements and move together, balancing the space, so being evenly spread in the space. Then they're no longer looking at they're not longer looking at any particular person, but they're looking at the flow of people in the space. They're looking at the spaces between the members of the group. And it sort of shifts perception from narrowing down on one individual to opening up and seeing the whole of a flow process. It's very powerful, very beautiful. And also to then introduce a kind of stop exercise. So you're in mid-flow with any kind of movement exercise, and I ask the group to stop, to pause, and there, right then, to sense more deeply into the body. And we undulate from pausing to action and back to pausing, always sensing in that moment, sensing more deeply into the body. And it kind of facilitates this dual process. There's this broadening of awareness, opening up to the whole, the periphery, seeing the whole, taking awareness of oneself, because you're having to notice what's happening in the space with other people, and then pausing and bringing awareness back to the self. So this sort of dual flow, and that seems to be really, really powerful. So this sort of open monitoring practice that I mentioned earlier, that really works very well. Whereas this focused attention is not something I would pursue so much in combination with creative practice. So the focused attention, when you're narrowing down on a particular aspect of experience, like the flow of breath, or focusing on one particular visual experience, often focused attention practices, if they're pursued in a visual channel, you might narrow down on, I don't know, looking at a candle, for example. So very much what I found, what is very beneficial and what the research seems to indicate as well, is the utilization of this open awareness process. Really, yeah, I'm doing it with my hands. It's expansive. It's the expansive process that is very supportive and nurturing of the creative process. Mm.
And Jessica, if I understand you correctly, it would seem as if that approach to cultivating mindfulness is very practical. It can be integrated into the stuff that we're busy with day to day, as opposed to a mindfulness-based exercise in the more traditional sense would be meditation, sitting down, becoming aware of thoughts, becoming aware of the breath, becoming aware of one's whole sense of self and relationship to others, but very much through fixating attention on these aspects of experience. And if I understand you correctly, this more dynamic, open awareness that includes the periphery, the space in between one and another, between everything, and that interrelatedness and flow that exists between us and everything. Cultivating mindfulness, creativity, that sense of interconnection, and this dynamic interplay, correct me if I'm wrong, could then be brought to all our tasks, including the challenges that we face day to day, in order to deal with them more resourcefully. Is that correct?
Definitely, yes. Definitely, yes. I mean, in the mental health context where I've worked a long time, that is what we see. That, I mean, I work in groups and I'm facilitating those processes. But the key moment of empowerment happens when people step out of the group and they begin to apply it in their own lives. In this, they're drawing on those techniques in a very subtle way, and they're integrating them into their own lives, no matter what they're doing. So I do really think you can draw on these techniques, and they can be very beneficial to everyday life. Approaching your everyday life in a more creative way, finding new ways of doing things. But it's not just about finding new ways of doing things. It's about, by opening your awareness, it's about appreciating that you can see things differently, that you can change your perspective, that there are things at the periphery which you have missed before, which you haven't seen because you've been too narrowly focused. As I'm sure you can, relate this to your own interest, Jevon, in peripheral awareness and that sense of opening. So I'm finding that creativity brings a playful component. People are, through creativity, encouraging themselves to approach everyday living and how they do things in a more unconventional way, and a more playful way, a more open way. And mindfulness does a similar thing. Mindfulness, again, encourages this sense of openness, and bringing the two together, well, introduces playfulness into your life and introduces the wider context. And you take those two combined, and you can really you start living again, no matter what life throws at you. You can draw on those two, and you can go with the flow, rather than running up against the wall here. You realize, I can move around the wall, and there's an opening here, and I can move in that direction. So it's this this going with the flow that I think is hugely beneficial there. This sense that there is only a wall here, but if I shift, there is no wall over there, and I can move and grow in many different ways, and ways that I hadn't foreseen. Yeah.
That's great. I wanted to get to a take-home message next, but one thing I'm already taking out of this is that practices like this more dynamic way of establishing mindfulness through, as I've put it once before, opening the aperture of awareness and becoming more aware of not just that object that we're focusing on, whether it's a creative pursuit or a challenge in one's life, but through becoming aware of it in the greater context, and having that broader field of awareness through that exercise enables one to find creative solutions to creative pursuits, challenges in life, to find your way around a wall that once upon a time blocked your entire way.
Yes.
I find that very exciting, because we talk about, you know, getting back into the flow and doing things that seem quite philosophical and nice, but how do we really do that stuff other than sitting down and meditating for 2 hours every day? And I'm starting to understand that there are a variety of ways through these approaches that you're focusing on and specializing in that can help individuals to move through life with greater ease and flexibility and resourcefulness and creativity. It's all good stuff.
Definitely. And I think what underpins this, all of this, is the realization that we're stuck only on a sort of superficial level. And you know, that's not to say that our stuckness is superficial, or, you know, isn't something to take serious. But if you realize that we're all much more than the ego, or than, you know, this small part of ourselves that is conscious. There is a much deeper aspect to ourselves that is speaking through us, flowing through us. And it's more a matter of increasing access to that which is wanting to flow through us, wanting to express itself through us. And it's a matter of getting out of the way of ourselves, in a way. Yeah, the ego is too much wanting to try and fix everything, wanting to be in control, wanting to, you know, I'm stuck and I'm going to figure out a way out of this. I'm going to solve this problem. I. And sometimes you almost need to get out of your own way and surrender to what is already going on a deeper level within yourself. That sounds contradictory in a way, you know. How do I do that? And you do that by tuning in, by listening into the body, by getting out of the intellect, out of the you know, the everyday mind, by deepening body awareness, using mindfulness. But you can also supplement that with creative techniques. You know, there is the work of Arnold Mindell, which is very relevant here, a process-oriented psychologist, who suggests that this unfolding process is a kind of dreaming process, which unfolds in our nighttime dreams, but is also unfolding in our daytime life, through bodily symptoms, for example, through the images which occupy our mind, through sometimes through auditory messages, where we're, you know, remembering words that seem to be stuck with us. If we can pay attention to what is going on there, if we can pay attention to that dreaming process, then we're diving more deeply into this place that animates us and that wants to speak through us. And that is the creative process. That is, you know, paying attention to that message and articulating what is coming through can be wonderfully done through creativity, through creative writing, where you're writing stream of consciousness, through movement practices where you're pursuing spontaneous movement rather than a fixed choreography. So you're moving spontaneously, you're not moving in movement patterns. Through visual improvisation, where you're doodling, you're just letting the pencil flow on the paper and you're not inhibiting that. All of those practices can really liberate that creative flow. Yeah, what you mustn't do is to kind of then begin judging and controlling that and saying it needs to have a certain outcome. You need to let it just guide you. You need to surrender to that creative flow, to that process. So tuning into the dreaming process, I think, is a crucial thing for anyone to foster and follow that creative flow that wants to happen through us. And when you do that, you also get a deeper sense for your purpose in the world, for what you can create in the world. So it's not an intellectual exercise, asking yourself all the time, why am I here? What's my purpose? But it's a dropping more deeply into yourself through mindfulness, through creative practices. You drop more deeply into yourself, and then fragments of the answer begin to emerge, begin to surface. And you honor those fragments. And that leads to a very much more enriched, meaningful life for each of us.
That sounds so extremely rewarding, and I can't think of any individual who shouldn't explore that. And you know, I think the world is going through what it's going through largely because people get caught up in a paradigm of thought, a paradigm of subsequent behaviors and actions that have landed us up in a lot of trouble. And if we can step out of that, be aware, drop in, as you put it, into the deeper sense of self, which I think is starting to point toward the authentic self, who we are when we're not occupied in our heads and believing those silly thoughts that have been programmed into our minds, but rather looking deeper at what else is there to me, to my life. And you've already suggested that it can help one to become more aware of one's purpose. And I think when these things bubble up into conscious awareness, that's transformative. And so there's immense value in these exercises that you've pointed toward here.
Mm-hmm. Very much so, yes. There's that sense of you're deepening your quality of life and what life is and what life can be. You broaden your perspective, and it's liberating because it's the recognition that something is unfolding through you, which is much bigger than it's like you can be much bigger than you ever imagine you can be. You step beyond the confines of the intellect, and you find a treasure cave of a collective intelligence and a collective riches that can really come to fruition through you. So we're all part of a bigger collective, and we have a collective responsibility to attend to this deeper process, to attend to what wants to unfold through us, to serve that. And it's very rewarding to be connected in this deeper way, rather than to stay at the intellectual level, which is about setting goals and needing to achieve certain things. And it's liberating, it's empowering, and it's a much more holistic and integrated way of being, acknowledging all of you and not just a part. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah.
And I think you're not suggesting that one should only do the practices that enable one to go deeper and to focus exclusively on that and negate the intellect and all of that, but rather to cultivate integrativeness and holism, such that one can identify, here's the time and place for intellect, here's the time and place to delve deeper, here's how I'm going to sort out this situation through a creative solution because I have the means to do so. So it's a way of being discerning, which really, to me, sounds like intelligence is being awakened, and we're becoming more fully human.
Yes, that's right. And absolutely, it's very true that the intellect has its role. No doubt about that. I work in academia a lot, and I use my intellect a lot. And also, it's important to be rigorous, as a practitioner, to be discerning. When is a creative exercise the right exercise? How do I combine it with mindfulness practice in a responsible way? Considering specific situations with client groups, who have you got in front of you, and then also being able to evaluate the impact of the practices. You know, so in mental health, that's very important. It's very important to look at what benefits are being generated by a particular practice. What are the boundaries of a particular practice for a particular target audience? So you need the intellect, there's no doubt about that, but you need a little bit of both. You know, I think we've been, in the Western world, we've been a little bit too intellect driven. We have been divorced from the body and the wisdom that comes from the realization that body and mind are one, that there isn't an artificial division between the two. So that is what I'm advocating, really, that we allow ourselves again to take that more holistic view, that more integrated perspective. And creativity and wisdom traditions have a huge role to play here, because I think they're often still they're sidelined in the mainstream. So I'm really thinking it's important that we put them on the map, whatever the context, whether the corporate training context, whether the context of mental health and how we treat mental ill health, and how we, you know, what is mental ill health, considering very carefully when we're talking about pathology, what are we talking about? And mindfulness, wisdom traditions, creativity bring very empowering alternative perspectives. Yeah. So just one example, for you know, when we look at the treatment of mental ill health, we know now that a psychosocial approach is extremely important. Drugs have a role to play, but they're not, or by any means, the only solution when it comes to treating mental ill health, depression, anxiety, and so on. Yes, drugs can be very helpful in enabling a client to enter into a more stable situation so that they can function day to day. But we know that there are so-called social determinants to mental ill health. You know, somebody's living circumstances, how much money they earn, whether they're caring for somebody in their family, you know, which creates a big psychological burden, whether they have some kind of physical ill health. All these factors are impacting on their mental health. So that means we shouldn't just be using drugs to treat mental ill health, but rather we should be looking at these social determinants, and we should be drawing on the full spectrum of approaches that we have to enable that person to improve their well-being. And that means also, you know, drawing on mindfulness practices, hugely beneficial there, drawing on creative practices, because, like we discussed earlier, these, particularly those two, creative practices, mindfulness practices, enable people to look at their lives in a broader way, and enable people to discover new alternatives for how they can be living their lives, because people in those circumstances are often very stuck. They're really stuck. They've hit rock bottom, and the drugs aren't doing anything to shift them out of that stuckness. But creative approaches are, and mindfulness approaches are, because they're resourcing individuals in a different way. They're enabling people to feel more empowered and begin to discover alternative ways of moving forward in their lives. So, you know, we need to put these things on the map. That's really, really important. Yeah.
And that's what your work's all about, Jessica. So good.
Yes.
For you. And before I ask you to let us know where we can get more information about your important work, one point that you've raised here, which really does open another subject that really ought to be another one of these interviews, I think, but the importance of healthcare practitioners having that mindfulness orientation toward their patients, such that they're not too quick to put patients in boxes to diagnose just that particular pathology based on a certain set of symptoms that the patient is displaying, but rather to look holistically at the bigger picture and to bring that more mindfulness, compassion-based approach to the treatment, and to deal with patients also in their communication style, instead of giving them a label too quickly that patients readily accept because it comes from the person in the white coat. So I think mindfulness in healthcare is so important for these reasons. Wouldn't you agree?
Very much so, yes. I recognize that for some health professionals it's very challenging to take this sort of broader, more integrated approach. You know, GPs in particular have very, very tight time slots in which they meet an individual, try to diagnose the problem, and then try to offer a solution. And so it's so easy for them to turn towards a drug prescription when it comes to something like depression. And really what's needed is that time. People, you know, you need to spend time with a client to really to take a moment and to see what other options are there. So for GPs in the UK, general practitioners, doctors, it is a very challenging situation. But there are other health professionals who have a greater luxury of time, who see their clients for longer, you know, time slots. And I also think that it's not just medical professionals who benefit from drawing from these approaches, but I think a broader spectrum of practitioners should be considered. Social care practitioners, teachers, you know, education contexts, schools should be drawing on these approaches to work on the prevention of, you know, on the preventative angle, so that people aren't just getting to these practices or approaches when they're in a deteriorated state, but early on they're learning these techniques so that they can manage challenges more effectively. I think what's needed is the training of medical professionals, social care professionals, so that they have these tools at their disposal. And I mean, I do this personally. I work, for example, through Tate Liverpool, which is a big art gallery based in Liverpool. And there we run a course. This is only an annual course once a year. And it is basically introducing creativity and mindfulness to health and social care professionals, taking them into the gallery context, working with them there to enhance their spectrum of tools. And that's a lovely course, but it's obviously on site, so it's not so broadly available to the world out there. But that is also one of the aims of the Alef Trust, to make this kind of training more broadly available. So, and this is there we're working in an online context. So there we have, you know, as you know yourself, we have online courses which tackle precisely those kinds of questions, making available a broad spectrum of practices using the online media. So there you can sign in and you can join one of our courses and learn more about this way of working. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing those resources with us, Jessica, and thank you so much for your time. Your knowledge and wisdom, definitely appreciated, and you're doing good work. So I certainly hope that there'll be enough interest coming from this video that will get out there, and perhaps it's just going to be that little drop in the ocean that makes a difference. So thank you so much for your time and energy.
You're very welcome, Jevon. It's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.